Good evening, everyone. My name is Quang Nguyen. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I am one of the Assistant Directors of Marketing and Special Projects for the Division of Student Affairs here at Wichita State University. I'm excited to have Isabel Medina Kaiser, our Director for the Office of Student Accommodations and Testing, joining us this evening, who will be sharing with us more information about accommodations for your shocker and accommodating makeup exams and classroom tests for your student as well. The Office of Student Accommodations and Testing was formerly known as Disability Services and Testing Services. But before I turn it over to Isabel, make sure you drop your questions in the chat, and we'll make sure to answer these questions as we host our table talk tonight. Be sure to enter your name in the chat to be entered in for a chance to win a prize this evening as well. So I'll turn it over to you, Isabel.
Okay, thank you. Let's just start up, I guess, with our PowerPoint. If we can put that up, wonderful. As our announcer just stated, we changed our name. It kind of feels like Prince, normally the artist normally known as Prince. But anyway, so we are now the Office of Student Accommodations and Testing. And I just wanted to invite you again to ask me any questions at the end. And so we'll start off with the presentation. First slide, please. So who determines that accommodations will be provided? Again, the Office of Student Accommodations and Testing is under Student Affairs, and we set the standards to determine what is reasonable accommodations that may meet the needs of students with disabilities. Again, we need documentation of the disability. So it could be the IEP, the 504, it could be a letter from your physician, a letter from the counselor. And so basically it just states the functional limitations of the student and how or what type of possible accommodations would be provided to the student that would, again, provide equal access to programs and services while still preserving academic standards. So next slide, please. So who is disabled under Americans Disability Act? A lot of people don't realize this is civil rights legislation that was passed in 1990. There's been some regulations and changes and amendments in 2010. But basically, a person who is disabled is a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity, has a record of such a disability, or is regarded as having a disability. Some of the life activities include, but are not just limited to learning, working, walking, breathing, hearing, seeing, and other additional physical or sensory functions. It's also focus. So that's why one of the areas that is a disability is ADHD. Again, if the individual qualifies as being disabled, then accommodations can be put in place to address their specific needs. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to go over some of the different disabilities that are registered through our office. And so one of the ones is learning. And for a lot of our college students, sometimes they don't realize that they have a learning disability. I'm dyslexic, but I didn't really get evaluated until I arrived in college and was trying to read 3 books, 3 chapters, for one class. And so it's a little bit different in college because there's a lot more reading to be done. And so sometimes that's when our students realize that they actually have a learning disability. So it's really important for you as parents to make sure that your students have been evaluated. And if they're still in high school, or if you have kiddos that are still in K through 12, making sure that that is one of the areas that gets addressed. So dyslexia is basically, best way to describe it, and I'll describe it in a real life situation. I was driving down the road one time in New Mexico, and I looked over at this billboard, and the billboard said, in my brain anyway, it said Brain's Small Engines. It was actually Brian's Small Engines. But whenever you're stressed out, your disability kicks up. And guess what? College is and can be stressful. So it could also be, when I'm reading, that the words will float off the page. Sometimes with dyslexia, it's when you're listening to a classroom and you hear something that's you think is right, but it's not. Sometimes you sound like Willy Wonka when Willy Wonka said, "Hey, stop, reverse that." Sometimes we reverse words. So sometimes that can be, kicking up for a student. It could be things like dyscalculia, which is an actual disorder of math, or dysgraphia. Maybe their handwriting is interesting. Sometimes it's short-term memory issues, spelling disorders, writing disorders. Next slide, please. It could be medical issues. So it could be a temporary situation, like maybe they break their arm or their foot because they decided to go skiing in Colorado for spring break. And so maybe they need like a van ride to their classroom or something to that effect. It could be that they have back injuries. We have students that have cancer. They're dealing with cerebral palsy, their Crohn's disease, lupus, migraines, MD, again, diabetes. The wonderful thing about the diabetes on our campus is we actually have a club, a T1 diabetes club, which one of my students started up. And I'm so glad that they have some type of support for them. Because that's one of the other things as a person with a disability, you always want to kind of connect with other people that have it. So, because usually they understand it better than anybody else. So it could also be things like food allergies. We're really wanting to focus on that because that's just as serious as any other disability. And especially if the student has never had to deal with the EpiPen, or maybe, not watching their food enough and parents may have watched it for them. So again, one of the things I really emphasize to parents is to do some transitioning for those youngsters that are coming into school, making sure they know how to get their medication, making sure they know what to do if their medication's not working, making sure that they know even how to wash clothes. Because I had one student and their parents had called me. We had a release, and we're going to talk about releases in a minute here. But the parents said, "Hey, what's going on? Bobby keeps, maxing out the um, the Walmart credit card." Well, they were worried that, the young man was, drinking or something, but brought the student in. We found out that basically it was he didn't know how to wash clothes, so he kept buying his shirts at Walmart. So again, just making sure that your students are being given that time to transition, especially within the summer, making sure that they know about how their disability affects their lives and how to work with that, and making sure that medication has been transferred, those kinds of things. Next slide, please. We have students with psychological issues. And again, that's really kicking up partly because of COVID, but also just because there's more people dealing with different stresses. So it could be anxiety disorder. We have around 65 students that fall under the diagnosis of autism or Asperger's. We have students that are dealing with depression, schizophrenia, traumatic brain injuries. Next slide, please. It's also things like hearing, speaking, or seeing. We may have a student who is deaf or hard of hearing. Could be that the student has a speech disorder. Could be that they have a vision disability. Next slide, please. I just wanted tonight to kind of go over with you the differences between K through 12 and college. My best way to say it is that the student is in the driver's seat. That is the most important thing to know. It's going to be, again, that student who's going to have to advocate for themselves to make sure that things happen. And so it's really important for them to find their voice. In K through 12, the students' records were accessible to the students and parents. In college, only the student has access to that. You couldn't even call our office. We can't even say, yes, the student is registered with our office unless a FERPA release has been signed. So it's really important that if you're wanting that information, that the student signs the FERPA release so that we can talk openly about any of your kind of concerns that you may have with the student. In K through 12, if there was a behavioral problem, there would be special consideration. In college system, students are held to the student code of conduct, so there's really no special consideration. So again, making sure that that student connects with our office, so in case we need to help advocate for that student in case some type of conduct issue kicks up, but they still are going to be held to the student's code of conduct. So again, it's really important that they know that. The next one is students are responsible to provide the documentation of the disability, and it's the student that has to contact our office in order to start kicking up that process. Next slide, please. In K through 12, success is more of a right. And in college, there is no guarantee for student academic success. Student is responsible for own academic success. Our responsibility as the college, as our office, is to make sure that the students has access, not so much success, but access to accommodations and assistive technology and things like that. In K through 12, there are special education classes that are provided. But in college, there's no special ed classes. Disability offices support, the accommodation to the student in that college level classes, but there are no special education and no modifications. The student has to do the full work. In K through 12, there was free evaluations of the disability, but in this situation, the student is responsible for the disability evaluation. We can have our CAPS program, our counseling program, do an actual evaluation for mental health. We will allow documentation from an evaluation from our counseling psych department. But again, it's really important that all the evaluations are kind of done ahead of time, because an evaluation can cost at least, $2,000, especially for a learning disability evaluation. So again, it's just great to plan for these kinds of things. Next slide, please. So in K through 12, it's called an IEP or a 504. In college, it's just basically reasonable accommodations. There are no IEPs or no 504s in post-secondary education. In K through 12, the district ensures that the IEP is implemented, or it could be also the district, the parent, and the student is responsible. In college, the student is responsible for their own academic progress. And so it's really important for the student to let us know if they're not receiving their accommodations. We try to ask for the student to advocate on their own at first. If they don't have any success, then they contact us. And then typically it's my duty to kind of address that issue to find out, why accommodations are not being provided. In K through 12, again, those services are identified on the IEP. In college, again, we're providing reasonable accommodations, but it's not an automatic process. Each college determines the eligibility and what kinds of reasonable accommodations will be provided based on the disability documentation provided. So again, students really need to find their voice and let us know what it is that they're needing and how their disability affects their academics. And also, is it a situation of housing? Maybe they need special housing requirements. Perhaps they're needing an emotional support animal. But again, documentation is going to be needed on both of those issues. Next slide, please. In K through 12, there's modifications. Again, there are no modifications within the college. And specifically, accommodations may not result in a fundamental alteration to a course or academic program, nor can it impose an undue burden on an institution. In K through 12, the teachers advocate for the student, but in college, student advocates for self. And again, I will advocate for students if they're not receiving their accommodations, but the student must let us know that they're not receiving accommodations and that they have tried on their own to see if the accommodations are going to be kicked up. But again, they need to let us know. In K through 12, there's personal services like a transportation, a personal attendant, nurse, that type of thing. In college, there are no personal services provided. We do provide a mobility van and that's typically not for severe mobility issues, in case a student needs to go from one classroom to another, and it may be that they are concerned about either getting winded. We do have students with long COVID, so that's sometimes a fatigue issue. Next slide, please. This again, please do, I know you're in front of a screen, so please use the QR code that goes to our website. And so that way you can go specifically to our application for the accommodations for continued services. So then the student needs to follow the instructions. Next slide, please. And if we need to, we can put that QR code up again later at the end. So the steps are basically this. The student goes to our website. We have not changed the website name, so it's still Office of Disability Services, so just so you know that. So they go to the website, click on the new student application. They fill out the application. It basically asks some demographic information, and then once we get the documentation, we will set up a meeting with our intake specialist. And so it could be via Zoom, it could be face-to-face, but the sooner the better. I wouldn't wait until the week that school starts because things get a little bit busy. So again, best to try to contact us now. After the intake specialist then processes the accommodation letters and sends them to the professor, but the student will also receive a copy of that accommodation letter. After the accommodation letters are sent out, the student will need to talk to their instructors, maybe email and just say, hey, this is what's going on. Do you have any questions? How are we going to implement these accommodations? Again, it's very important that, if the student gets any kind of, oh my God, I have to deal with accommodations or any kind of negative reaction, I want to know about that so that can be addressed. Next screen, please. So if the student is wanting to do continued services for the next semester, the student must go back into the AIM student portal, again on our website, select which classes they want their letters to be sent to. They don't need to provide new documentation unless their disability has changed, gotten worse, or maybe they have a new diagnosis. It's not uncommon for students to have up to 8 different diagnoses whoa, okay, that just blanked out. Hang on. So, where was I? Oh, okay. So again, continued services. Then again, we will send out the accommodations to the student. And again, the student needs to contact their professors to discuss the accommodation. Next slide, please. Again, all this information is confidential. I can't emphasize that any more than that. A lot of our students are thinking, oh my God, if I get accommodations, it's going to be put on my degree. It's going to say engineering with accommodations. No. The only persons that know that the student is receiving accommodations is the student, my office, and the professor that receives the accommodation. So we really push the confidentiality information. And again, that's why if you're wanting to know more information on what's going on with your student within our office, the FERPA form will need to be signed. Next slide, please. So we're going to just talk about some testing accommodations. And again, this is all depending on the documentation that we have and what type of disability we're dealing with. But it could be extended testing time. It could be a private testing room, group testing room, use of a computer, use of a calculator, flexibility with exams or due dates. And that's typically for our students with medical issues. We do the accommodated testing at the WSU testing services, which is now under our umbrella. And the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about testing services. Next slide, please. So again, basically, if the student is interested in taking a test out of the classroom or doing a makeup exam for accommodations, or wanting special other proctored testing for things like the ACT, could the GRE, some of the other types of tests, they can take these tests at the testing services and it will be proctored. It's important that the student realizes that, again, they are in the driver's seat, so they need to fill out the request to set the actual test, and they're the ones that make sure that they show up on time. The responsibility of the professor is to provide the information about the test and also the copy of the test. So it's kind of, again, two people making sure that things get done. Next slide, please. It could be classroom accommodations, could be use of a sign language interpreter. We use a thing called a smart pen. The smart pen records what you're hearing in the class, but it also records what you're writing. And that's so important for students that maybe have a focus issue, could be that they're traumatic brain injury, any of those kinds of things, because then they can use the pen, go back to their dorm or their apartment, put it into the computer, and they get to hear and see everything that was going on in the classroom, which is so helpful, especially when that professor says this will be on the test. So that will definitely be a benefit for students. It could be that the student has dietary accommodations. It could be the student has a service animal. It could be that maybe there's a diabetic episode, making sure that the student is allowed to check their blood or use their phone to be able to check their blood. The most important part is emergency evacuation, because it's so important if we have a student whose mobility is limited to make sure that they know how to get into a basement or wherever the emergency evacuation area is. So that's something that we've been really pushing. Next slide, please. Could be academic or non-academic type of accommodations. It could be priority class registration. That, again, is mostly for medical issues. It could be that the student may need a single room. Right now is not the time to try to ask for a single room because most of the housing is already filled. So again, if that's something that the student is interested in for the next semester, we can see if a single room is available. I've stated before that it's also an accommodation, could be an emotional support animal or an assistance animal. Again, we need legitimate documentation for that. Next slide, please. We're really pushing about accommodations for practicums, internships, and clinical settings. My goal is for our students to know that accommodations don't just end, at, college. And we provide accommodations to students that are going for their associates, for their bachelor's, for their master's, and for their PhD. But I want them to know that accommodations are also available in the workplace. And these are just some of the things that we work on as far as accommodations within practicums, internships, and clinicals. Next slide, please. This is a great website. It's called the Job Accommodation Network. Again, you can type in Ask Jan or Job Accommodation Network, but it really talks about what possible workplace accommodations can be given to that student. So again, our focus is really to make sure our students not only know about their accommodations at school, but what is possible in the workplace. Next slide, please. Most important thing for your student is to gain knowledge of how their disability affects their academics and their day-to-day living. That is the most important part. Next slide, please. And the biggest issue is self-advocacy. One of the quotes here is, advocating for what you believe in is crucial. However, if you don't ask for it, people assume you don't need it. So again, even if your student is hesitant about connecting with us, let's at least get the process started, get the documentation put in, do the intake meeting. If the student says, I don't want to use my accommodations this semester, that's okay. The only problem is we can't go backwards. And so we can't really change something like not showing up to class, before the accommodations letters are sent out, or not getting the homework turned in and things like that. So it's really important, again, to let the student know, my gosh, number one, we have around 800 students that are registered with our office, so they're not alone. There's lots of other students that are using accommodations, and as I said before, We have students that are graduating that, with their PhD and their master's and their BA, that are using accommodations. No shame. Okay. Next slide. Just want to announce that we're going to be doing a Shocker Summer Immersion August 14th through the 18th. It costs $75, and basically it's a 5-day program where we're really going to talk to the students about self-advocacy. We're going to talk about their own learning styles. We're going to make sure that some of the programs come and show up and talk to them, like testing and the counseling program, and even how to make food in a microwave. Especially if, maybe they have food allergies, or just knowing that they need a snack at nighttime and knowing how to do that and making sure that it's healthy. So the students are going to, we're going to talk about active reading, note taking, test taking, and summary writing. And then the students will practice using some of these skills on how to make, do an oral presentation focusing on their individual learning profile. So we're going to talk about what's the best way that they learn, what are their strengths, because I really feel that our students need to know their strengths. It's not just all our weaknesses, it's also our strengths. And next slide, please. So we are located in Grace Wilkie room 203. Yes, I know it doesn't make sense to have a student disability program on the second floor, but the greatest news is that we will be moving into the Clinton Hall area, and we're going to be on the first floor. So again, the Office of Student Accommodation and Testing is our new name, and our phone number is 316-978-3309. Our email at this time is disability.services@wichita.edu. And I guess we can start opening it for questions.
Thank you, Isabel, for
You're
that
welcome.
presentation. So we do have some questions in the
Okay.
chat. So I am operating this by myself tonight. So I am looking through the chat here. So we're going to scroll back up here. So Jerry did ask a question here. So I'm going to pop it onto the screen. It says, my son submitted a form online a couple of weeks ago, but has not heard back yet.
Okay.
When can we expect to hear back? Thanks.
And whenever the student does the application and it's been through our office, we send an email out to the email that the student provided to us. So it's really important for that student to check their emails. That's usually something that kicks up, that they are not checking their emails, but check both their WSU email and their personal email. And it will be an email that says, hey, we're trying to set up a meeting with you. When would be a good time to do that? Your son can also contact our office at the number that I just gave, the 3309, or email at the disability email. And we can, again, I look through that email, so go ahead and have that student send that to me, and we'll make sure that it gets addressed.
I would also encourage checking their spam inbox as well. So sometimes it does go to spam. So definitely check both of your email spam accounts. So that is grateful tips. The second question here is from Kimberly. It says, do you provide suggestions of accommodations available to each student?
Again, we build it for each student, because sometimes, like, you may have a student who has ADHD, okay, and not every student needs the same type of accommodations that every ADHD student has, because that disability may affect that student in a different way. So what's really important is for the student to say, these are the things that I'm having troubles with. And then we can look at the possible different accommodations that we have out there. We sometimes are even having to be pretty creative on some of our accommodations. It could be that maybe the student has problems with the lighting. So we can look at the physical lighting in the classroom. We can make a suggestion of maybe accommodation would include having a hat, could be dark glasses. It just depends on the disability. But it's very important for the student to explain to us how it affects them. So that way we have that information and can look at what other possible accommodations. And also the Job Accommodation Network would be a good place to look also.
That's very important information. So thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
The next question that I have here is from Deborah. So, once a student has enrolled in classes, will the intake letter be sent to the instructors? My daughter has been informed that she has courses for fall, but she has not seen a copy of any intake letters.
And we don't send out the fall intake letters until about a week before the semester starts, only because the professors get kind of confused on, is this an accommodation for the summer or is this for fall? So they will be receiving that at least a week or maybe even two before school actually starts.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And if the student has not received theirs by that first week, again, have that student contact us on that disability services email, so that we can make sure that we're aware of things.
And I did put it back onto the screen here, so you can definitely contact disability.services@wichita.edu. So definitely write that down if you do have any questions.
Or take a picture.
Yes. Any other questions in the chat here? Looking through the chat again here. Does anyone else have questions for tonight? All right, seeing none. Before we put an end to the session tonight, we do have the drawing for tonight's winner. So I am looking and seeing here that tonight's winner is Brian Prince. So congratulations, Brian Prince. You are winning some Shocker swag from One Shocker. We'll definitely have that get sent in the mail to you here, and we'll have that here in the next few days for you. So congratulations.
And is it possible to put the QR code back up?
Yes.
It can be the last slide, because it's for all three of the.
Yes. Let me put that back up here. So let me go here and we'll put that back up here. So that is the QR code.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
Again, we try to meet where the students are, and they're so more techie than I am. So.
Yes, and if you cannot scan that QR code, we did put that into the chat as well. So if you scroll back up into the chat, we did put that as the QR code link. So if you are not able to access that on your phone, you can definitely copy and paste that link or click on that link to access the Office of Student Accommodations and Testing website. Again, thank you all for joining us tonight. That's all for tonight's session. We look forward again to seeing you all at our upcoming One Shocker Family Table Talks. You can check us out for our other topics at wichita.edu/shockerfamily. And of course, thank you again, Isabel, for joining us this evening just to share us very insightful information about accommodations and testing for your shockers. And so thank you so much for this insightful information, and hope you all have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you.